For as long as humanity and civilizations have existed, conflict inevitably has resulted from disagreement, for what cannot be solved with peace is thus solved with violence. When conflict arises, each side is defined by some unifying quality, whether it be the shared culture or ancestry of that group, similar political or religious ideologies, or some other factor that pits them against other groups that are different in those regards. Conflict can arise from concerns over where power is or will be, and who will hold on to that power. And even in the bloodiest conflicts, people are willing to endure more than they can bear, until they clutch victory, surrender, or lie dead. Hajime Isayama's series, Attack on Titan, provides such views into conflict. This video essay about Man and Titans will be taking a political look into ethnic identity and conflict, the problems of commitment, and the political concept of resolve in the series. The video assumes that you have already watched the series or read the manga, but if you haven't, and/or you don't care for spoilers, here's a quick synopsis. The series revolves around Eren and his friends Mikasa and Armin as they fight alongside the remnants of humanity in the Scout Regiment against giant titans that had breached the walls that had kept them safe for the past century and caused massive casualties and destruction in their hometown. Sounds simple enough. Until you find out that Eren is capable of turning into a titan, the walls have titans in them, there are traitors in the Scout Regiment capable of transforming into titans, that all titans are just humans who have been transformed but some are more intelligent than others, and that there exists one founding titan with the ability to manipulate memories. In addition, the royal family who's ruled over humanity's remnants used the founding titan's power to hide the fact that humanity was not confined within the walls, but there were humans outside the walls the whole time. Got all that? Good. Because now I can explain some items in depth. Once the scope of the series widens from man against titans to man against man, it then revolves around the clashing of two groups, Eldians and Marleyans. Eren, his friends, and the survivors of humanity, who all lived on the island of Paradis, are Eldians, named after the Eldian tribe that conquered other tribes 2,000 years before the events of the story. During that ancient time, a captured slave girl named Ymir stumbled into a tree trunk inhabited by an organism that contains the power of the Titans, thus making her the first and founding Titan. Eldian royalty used this power to conquer many other lands outside the island, establishing an empire that crumbled 1900 years later under the collective work of infighting between inheritors of the Titans' power and an uprising by the conquered peoples. The Marleyans are one such people in revolt, and the lands they lived on are directly across the sea from the island of Paradis. After their uprising led by the legendary hero Helos, the Eldian Empire collapsed and retreated to the island of Paradis, building the walls with titans to keep their people safe. It was then the Marleyans established the nation of Marley. However, not all Eldians escaped, and those who were left behind were confined to internment zones, and relegated to second-class citizens at best, devils at worst. We'll get into why this is in a bit, as it plays into one of the four major explanations of ethnicity and ethnic conflict. It's also important to note that we'll be examining ethnic Eldians and ethnic Marleyans, not necessarily the nations of Eldia, which I'll be referring to as Paradis and Marley. But again, that plays into one of the four major explanations of ethnicity and ethnic conflict. So how do we define ethnicity and ethnic conflict? And how do our real-world definitions play into this fictional series? There's a scholarly paper written by Brown University political scientist Ashutosh Varshni that defines ethnic identity and conflict through four major camps: essentialism, instrumentalism, constructivism, and institutionalism. We'll go in the reverse order as I mentioned, particularly because the first camp, essentialism, is a major lens present in the series, normally not seen in the modern world, and I want to take more time to look into that camp of thought. Institutionalist thought holds that the institutions present in a state, meaning the government established and the rules that it and its people follow, dictate whether or not ethnic conflict will be present in a nation. This theory runs into problems when applying it to the series for one sole reason. We know very little about the government structures in both nations. Therefore, any interpretations under this theory are thus very limited. The series does not elaborate much about the government of Marley, other than it is an imperial, expansionist power with a relatively strong military. What we do know is that these institutions have been able to keep dissent within the Eldian internment zones relatively limited, due to combined military presence and conscription, as well as the education, or propaganda, depending on how you look at it, about world history. So as a result, ethnic conflict is very limited to our knowledge within Marley. Meanwhile, Paradis' government went through numerous changes, but the specifics about the governments themselves are seldom mentioned. The Rise royal family ruled the island for about 100 years, but a coup transformed it from a monarchy with a puppet ruler and solidified nobility class to a monarchy led by a member of an offshoot branch of the royal family, but reduced power of the nobility, only for it to again experience a military insurgency led by the Jaegerists. This is the faction of the military that supports Eren and his goals of the Rumbling. Despite this, we know that ethnic conflict was minimal because the island was overwhelmingly homogeneous, and as a result, cleavages occurred along socioeconomic lines more than ethnic ones. The only notable exception lies in the initial persecution of the Eastern and Ackerman clans by the larger nobility due to their resistance to the memory erasure abilities that the royal family relied on to maintain their position of power. But even then, that was more so out of a threat to power than it necessarily was out of genuine racism from the general populace. Therefore, institutionalism can be very limited in terms of its applications towards the series. In the real world, constructivism holds that ethnic and national identity is a construct of the modern era, born as a result of the coinciding tides of industrialization and nationalism. It's not to say that ethnic identity did not exist before the rise of industrialization and nationalism, as people still affiliated with some kind of ethnicity. It's just that affiliation overwhelmingly existed at a local level. This means that you would have identified with the local village or tribe you were a part of more so than the king or other type of leader of your country.
King of the who?
The Britons.
Who are the Britons?
Well, we all are. We are all Britons. And I am your king.
Oh, didn't know we had a king.
Noble, aristocratic, or ecclesiastical identities were some of the few that existed at the broader level. This change started with the printing press and emergence of capitalism, and drastically accelerated once nationalism and industrialization picked up steam. Picked up steam. The question is, how do we apply this to the world of Attack on Titan? They do not exactly have a historical trajectory like the real world. For the sake of this analysis, we can define the series' beginning of their modern era as the Marleyan uprising against the Eldian Empire. From the Eldian retreat to Paradis Island and the King's vow-renouncing war, to the breaching of Wall Maria that puts the events of the series into motion, a period of about 102 years passes. It was during this period of time that Marley and other nations began their period of industrialization and nationalism. A century doesn't sound like a lot, but if we draw comparisons to a real-life nation, for this let's go with the United Kingdom, it makes a ton of sense. Most historians and scholars believe that Britain began its first industrial revolution in the 1750s and ended around the 1830s or 40s. That's a period of less than 100 years. It's reasonable that Marley could have developed the technology in the series within that time, and with supernatural elements such as the power of the Titans, that time could have been shortened. During that time, Britain developed steam power technology, culminating with the first steam locomotive in 1830. During the Second Industrial Revolution from the 1870s up until World War I, new technologies such as planes, airships, cars, steel ships, and electricity came into development. We see all this technology in Marley, although based on discussions within the military, such technologies are being improved upon for the purpose of war. Lastly, it was during the era of industrialization that Britain began a new wave of imperialism throughout the world, both as a means to locate new natural resources to fund its industrialization and with the byproduct of solidifying some overarching British identity. Marley has already carved out a continental empire for itself when we are first introduced to the nation, and part of the reason they choose to pursue Paradis is because of the natural resources on that island. With our baseline set, we can look at Marley and Paradis for our application of constructivism. As mentioned, the ethno-national Marleyan identity was formed once industrialization and imperialism occurred in their modern era. To be Marleyan was to share the common history of overthrowing the cruel Eldian Empire. To be Marleyan was to enjoy the airships flying above you or attend the markets with electricity running through the streets. To be Marleyan was to cheer at your people's latest successful invasion. To be Marleyan was to watch your children jump off the trains that brought them from the latest warfront to your arms so that you may hug them. At least that part holds true if you are an honorary Marleyan. A true Marleyan was seldom needed for ground combat, as foreigners and devils fighting for them makes it easier for them to live their lives. Paradis, on the other hand, was late to this due to its isolation from the rest of the world. Their century-long period of isolationism obviously would have prevented them from acquiring many of the technologies of the rest of the industrialized world. Only when word of the outside world spreads do they begin to industrialize, thanks to the help of the Azumabito clan from the nation of Hizuru to the east. Though they lagged behind in industrialization, nationalism did not come far behind, as the identity of remnants of humanity did change to being Eldians once the island found out about the outside world. Arguably, it was a reformation of the Eldian identity formed from their Titan imperialism and the Eldian Empire, and it was that historical spirit that the Jaegerists would exploit in their military coup. One more tenet of this school of thought relies on the idea that these identities are long-term and sticky, meaning that they are very difficult to change. With the system of Eldian internment zones, that idea is highly prominent within Marley. But for both Marley and Paradis, these identities get blurred once you move into instrumentalist thought. That being said, constructivist thought runs into a major problem. It only explains the formation of ethnic identity, but not why ethnic conflict occurs. At most, it attributes ethnic conflict to a master cleavage that exists within nations, where there are different religions or different tribes. This is seen in a sense whenever you examine Marleyans and their treatment of the interred Eldians, but the theory simply boils conflict down to, there are two groups that are different in some regard, thus they don't like each other. Remember what I said about constructivism relying on the stickiness of an identity? Instrumentalist thought is the other side of that coin, as it stresses that ethnic identities are actually flexible and malleable. How is this so? Instrumentalist thought, according to Varshni, states that, quote, ethnicity is neither inherent in human nature nor intrinsically valuable, end quote. That's philosopho-political language that means ethnicity is not fixed, but rather it is easily definable and redefinable. Who defines it? Political elites who use the idea of ethnicity or ethno-nationalism to gain support for a certain political or economic goal. Most political scientists point to Slobodan Milosevic using the idea of ethnic Serbs during the breakup of Yugoslavia and his involvement concerning Bosnia and Kosovo as contemporary examples of instrumentalism. Both Marley and Paradis heavily rely on instrumentalist thought, and there are plenty of examples throughout. Hypothetically, Marley could have assimilated the remaining Eldians into their society. They could have become Marleyans who happened to be subjects of Emir. But the political elites at the time, coupled with general resentment of the Eldian Empire, created the two-tier system that enforces ethnic superiority. The Marleyan military dangles a carrot over Eldians who are selected as warriors and inherit the power of the Titans, saying that they and their families can repent for their ancestors' sins and become honorary Marleyans if they fight for Marley. We see a further sense of instrumentalism in Willie Tyburn's declaration of war. Before his speech, we learned that despite being of Eldian heritage, the Tiber family is actually part of the upper echelons of Marleyan society and has significant influence over political leaders. Once he recounts the tale of the Marleyan uprising, he reveals that it was an Eldian king who wanted to pull out of Marley and made the vow renouncing war, to prevent further conquests by Eldians from ever happening, until Eren Yeager stole the Founding Titan's power. In his speech, Tiber lambasts his own family as taking advantage of Eldian suffering for their own benefit, and that Eldians as a race can never atone for their previous sins, but despite that, he wishes to live. All Eldians wish to live. And he brings forth the idea to all in attendance that to fight against Eren and the island of Paradis, these notions of race and ethnicity must be cast aside as they fight against a common threat.
I have always hated my blood, and more than anyone, I have wished that my race would disappear. However, I confess that I want to live, that despite everything, I believe this world is my birthright, just as it is yours. The people gathered here may belong to different races, different nations, but if we're to survive this crisis, then for the first time in history, we must join as one.
Meanwhile, in Paradis, instrumentalism found a twofold purpose both in terms of before and after the first coup led by Scout Regiment Commander Ervin Smith. Before the coup, the elites around the Pretender King relied on the notion that all of humanity is protected by the walls, and anyone who commits any action that transgresses that protection violates the Charter of Humanity, as they accused Ervin of doing before it turns out they themselves committed an actual violation when faced with the hypothetical threat of another wall breach. Once the coup occurs and the knowledge of the outside world is found out, the Jaegerists rely on verbal and physical tactics to rally the masses behind Eren. They are elite in a sense because of their connection to and support for Eren, who has the power of 3 Titans by the time he unleashes the rumbling. Even after Eren is gone, this elite continues to stir the idea that the world will come after the Eldians, so Eldians must be ready to fight. So, instrumentalism seems to be a stronger explanation of ethnic conflict thus far, but like all theories, it has some pitfalls of its own. The major one being, it assumes that people are all too willing to follow the elites, and that ethnicity matters very little to them. For every person all too willing to go to war, there is someone who is opposed to conflict for some reason. Few wage war blindly for the sake of some identity, and especially on behalf of some elite. The warrior candidate Eldians may be some of the most willing for the sake of the status they would earn, but other Eldians in Marley, and certainly many actual Marleyans, would be less willing to fight in a war. Plus, Eldians in Marley may harbor some resentment towards the Tybers for the fact that they had not shared the fate of their people.
The Tybers have been living lives of luxury and freedom. They've never fought for their country or their people. Why should they get to play hero now?
In parody, the Jaegerists, though an elite, are somewhat of a minority on the island, so much so that they have to lead a military coup of their own to try and force governmental support for their cause. Their popularity comes around eventually, and they gain government control, but not during the main events of the series. Essentialism, or sometimes also referred to as primordialism, is arguably the most basic but most flawed school of thought. It holds that ethnic identity is defined by history and culture of a certain region, but those identities are unchangeable, as those identities become ingrained in people's blood. As a result, any conflict stems from the fact that people who share a certain blood will always oppose those of a different blood. They will constantly fight and never get along. Now, any political scientist worth their salt in the modern era knows that this school of thought is very flawed and is actually pretty racist. Don't forget, it was this notion of cultural blood that has accounted for many genocidal events, most notably used to justify the Holocaust during World War II. But that doesn't stop regular people from believing in it. And in Attack on Titan, where supernatural powers are ingrained in blood, this thought has a breath of life within the series. Let's go back to Ymir's acquisition of the power of the Titans. We know that when Ymir acquires that power, the King of Eldia is keen on making sure that it's utilized to its full potential. Ymir has the king's children, and when she dies, the power is passed down via consumption of the corpse where power resided. Sorry for grossing you non-watchers out. Fritz makes his children consume Ymir's corpse, primarily the spinal fluid, and commands them on his deathbed to continue this cycle where this power rooted in the blood is disseminated. A couple hundred years later, those who contain the power of the Titans within them, whether pure, abnormal, or one of the 9, become the majority within the Eldian population. This then makes anyone who has some power of the Titans within them a subject of Ymir. Once technology and human spirit cripples the Eldian Empire and pushes it to Paradis Island, this is where essentialist thought is utilized in the series. Internment zones around the world, most notably in Marley, keep Eldians within them in order to limit the spread of Eldian blood and mitigate any conflict that may arise. Eldians within these internment zones are taught about the Eldian devil's blood and the sins of their past, but that despite this blood, Eldians can contribute to Marleyan society by using that blood to fight for them. And if one can become a warrior, they and their families can become honorary Marleyans for their service to the nation that took them in out of pity, but kept their arm's distance. Despite the strengthened position essentialism holds in the series, it too contains many flaws present throughout. If conflict between ethnicities and essentialist thought holds that different ethnic groups can never live together, why then does violence ebb and flow? Under this theory, Marleyans and Eldians could have kept fighting when the Empire crumbled. But don't forget the king's vow renouncing war. It's this vow that prevents further violence and allows for 100 years of relative peace before conflict once again rises. Even with all the power in the world, people cannot and do not want to fight forever. Constructivists counter with the thought that since large-scale ethnicity was a modern idea, how then could ethnic animosity be primordial in nature? We've talked about different theories of ethnicity that explain some kinds of conflict. But what about problems that govern war in general? A lot of conflict is governed by a desire for power. Power Power in international relations refers to the idea that actor A can get actor B to do something that actor B would normally not want to do, but is compelled to do under a threat of some kind, usually force. Obviously, the more power one has, the more influence and control they have over others and the global stage. To avoid war, actors may resort to bargaining to try and make commitments with each other. But when bargaining fails or commitments are not upheld, war between those actors can arise. So what failures over commitment and sources of power in Attack on Titan led to the conflict present throughout the series? Oftentimes, there were concerns between actors over where power resides for future benefit. In the real world, it may often be geography containing valuable natural resources or tactical advantages, or the possible weaponry available to them in the future. The actor stronger in power will be concerned if the weaker actor gains a new source of power, as the former strength will be threatened. Thus, the stronger power will usually do what it can to maintain its advantage. The weaker actor, on the other hand, will be concerned that if it enters into an agreement with the stronger actor, then the stronger actor will either demand further concessions or will renege on its agreement and attack the weaker power. In the series, by the time the Marleyan uprising occurs, the power situation has reversed from the initial conquests of the Eldian Empire. Marley had wrestled control of 7 of the 9 Titans, leaving the Founding and Attack Titans outside of their immediate control. Though most of the power was lost when the vow-renouncing war was made, Karl Fritz still had the power of the Founder and the threat of the Rumbling, which alone was enough to deter any attacks on the island for a century, as that power was passed down through his bloodline. This was the status quo that kept the two powers out of conflict for that period of time. But when the world's technology was beginning to catch up to the power of the Titans, Marley then saw it was imperative to attain the Founding Titans' power in order to maintain their military edge. The Marleyan government initially thought that it would be of limited concern for their parody invasion. As part of the vow-renouncing war, stated that any revenge incursion on the island would be accepted, by the monarchy at least. When Eren is revealed to have the power of the Attack Titan, Reiner and Bertolt do their best to persuade Eren to come back to Marley with them, as doing so would allow for Marley to maintain the status quo and prevent a weaker power from gaining any advantage against the stronger power. But when Eren's fist connects with the Titan that ate his mother, the stakes change. Greatly. When two actors attempt to negotiate, the stronger actor is more likely than not to receive a greater end of the deal. If that's not the case, the stronger actor knows it can wage war effectively and get what it wants even though there is more cost than getting the same deal through bargaining. However, once the possibility of some economic, technological, or military development is discovered and undertaken by the weaker actor, the stronger actor becomes concerned that unless it wages war now, the weaker actor will gain enough power to reverse the roles and emerge stronger out of a bargaining or conflict situation. The war that the stronger actor wages in response to a possible threatening change to power is known as a preventive war. Once it's discovered that it's Eren who has the Founding Titan's power, the stakes were revisited and the balance of power becomes precarious. Since Eren is not of royal blood, he is not bound by the vow-renouncing war, therefore is able to use the Founding Titan's power to full capacity, so long as he makes contact with a member of the royal family. These issues, coupled with the seizure of the female and colossal titans, the usage of the crystals underneath the Rice's family estate, and the industrialization Parody undergoes, means Parody's new power poses a threat to the weakening Marley. It is such a scenario that the Marleyan government dreaded and thus pushed for another invasion of the island that led to the events in the final season. The way Marley sees it, if it wages a concerted attack with other global powers against Eren and Parody, it can maintain its position of power over the island so long as Eren remains unable to achieve contact with a royal family member. By waging a preventive war, it will limit Parody's growth in power while allowing Marley to continue its goal of achieving greater power in the form of the Founder. Although, once Eren makes contact with Zeke and unleashes the Rumbling, the stakes in power are reversed drastically. The global allied fleet and airships that could have taken out a weaker Parody stood no match against the colossal titans of the Rumbling. While Willie Tiber and Marley saw it as a chance to strike to prevent Parody's growth in power, Eren saw it differently.
Consider this a declaration of war!
Normally, when two powers attempt to bargain, regardless of strength, each will fear the possibility that the other side has an incentive to let talks fall apart or to renege on an agreement and enter into war by striking first and catching their enemy off guard. Any such attack is referred to as a first strike advantage, and its general goal is to debilitate and prevent the enemy from attacking for at least some period of time. This is what Pearl Harbor was in Japan's eyes. The surprise attack, which came as a result of failed talks between the US and Japan, was meant to cripple the US Navy in the Pacific for some period of time. If actors believe such a first strike is imminent, this is what's referred to as preemptive warfare. Where better does this present itself in the series than Eren's attack on the Liberio internment zone? Eren manages to wipe out most of Marley's top military officials, acquire the power of the Warhammer Titan, get the Beast Titan to defect, and destroy Marley's primary military naval port. All the while killing top global diplomats and numerous Marleyan and intern Eldian citizens alike. The attack makes sense given the logic of preemptive warfare. Eren and many who supported him knew Marley was very unwilling to negotiate and would at some point launch a war against him, so he launched a first strike to disable and debilitate much of Marley's military and economic capabilities. This gave the people on the island some time to prepare before an incoming response attack. Although a global military response was being crafted, the Marleyan warrior unit decided to launch a surprise attack first before the rest of the global alliance was ready to go to war. However, despite this being a surprise attack, it's not considered a first strike advantage because a state of war has already been induced, so it's not technically an attempt to weaken Parady's military capabilities, but to continue in the state of war by getting revenge for Liberio. Whenever two or more actors interact with each other, be it in bargaining or in war, they are not always going to know what the other side's full capabilities are, which means they hold incomplete information. When it comes to military and civilian capabilities, some of that information, known and unknown, can be quantifiable. How many soldiers does a military have out of its full population? How many ships, planes, or guns do they have? The GDP, and what percent of its economy is dedicated to its military at any point, and so much more. The way some actors see it, if they have more of these data points than the enemy, and in better quality, hypothetically, victory will be on their side. But there's always a small bit of information that is very difficult to quantify. Resolve. Resolve in international relations is defined as the willingness of an actor to endure costs in any interaction. One actor may have the numerical advantage over another, but if that latter actor is willing to endure heavy costs for the sake of, say, defense, independence, or freedom, then it makes it difficult to end the war unless that resolve is broken. Going back to the World War II example, the Japanese state was willing to endure the costs of war and was resolved to fight, until the US broke that resolve with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Meanwhile, during the Vietnam War, the US faced major difficulty in breaking the resolve of the North Vietnamese and was later forced to pull out of that conflict despite being the quantitatively stronger power. Even when it's not defined through a lens of international relations, resolve is a heavy theme present throughout the story of Attack on Titan. Those within the walls of Paradis were willing to endure casualties to no end for the sake of a victory. How many times did the Survey Corps expedition suffer heavy losses of their squadron even before they had any success? Despite all their different goals, how did they manage to overcome the enemy Titans? Despite all they had lost and all that had been gained, Reiner and Bertolt decided that they had to complete their mission of infiltrating Paradis. Marley's resolve broke once they came back defeated, but they managed to fight against the superior technology of the Mid-East Alliance before they decided it was time to pursue a second Paradis operation. And when that came, was Paradis willing to lay down against an enemy technologically and logistically superior to them? No. They fought, even with the odds stacked completely against them. But resolve is arguably a double-edged sword, for if the stronger actor of two has the quantitative advantage and a greater resolve to fight by any and all means necessary, then war gets more messy and leads to dangerous outcomes. Eren, confronted by the reality of the actual world and possessing an unchecked power of the Founding Titan, is resolved to achieve the Founder's form and unleash the rumbling against the world that has wronged him and the people who see the Eldians as devils. Mind you, he succeeds in near omnicide of the human race. 80% of the world's population trampled or burned to death as he is resolved to build the world he believed according to the book he and Armin read as a child. A world where his people lived safely and where no human lived in the natural wonder of the world outside the island. But despite the unleashing of the rumbling, did the island devils and warriors lay down and die when the odds seemed completely against them? No. They put their differences aside to save the world from their common enemy, and they fought despite the odds. But why? Attack on Titan is not just a series about man fighting titans. It's a series that tries to have people come to terms with the world around them, how they perceive it, and how they act upon those perceptions. Once the veil around our protagonists' eyes are lifted, they come to understand that the world outside their paradise is full of people just like them. In that world exists strife and racism built on the perceived idea of an identity that must be defined, segregated, and utilized as the recipients of vengeance for the sins of their ancestors. While some choose to seek greater understanding and achieve peace with the outside world, others like Eren are confronted with the reality of the world and decide that so long as they have the power, they can remake the world as they saw fit. Since Eren assumed no one would be willing to understand who Eldians' actual people are, why not play into their stereotypes of Titan-shifting devils until they are trampled? These confrontations with the world are enough to turn some of our protagonists into great antagonists, and vice versa. And explanations of ethnic conflict, commitments and changes in power, and resolve can provide a greater look not only into the great writing of the series, but also of our own world. As is becoming increasingly obvious, the more we study the world and its history, the more we realize that humans are not driven solely by logic, but also by emotions. In our emotions, we attribute different groupings of people based on perceived commonalities, while logic seeks to derive why these groupings exist and why people of different groups seek to fight each other and live amongst each other peacefully at different times. War, for all the logic there is in winning a battle, can be sparked by harnessing the emotions of a people due to a perceived wrong or great threat to society, and logic seeks to derive why wars are fought and how people may seek to defeat their enemy by perceived threats and by surprise attacks. But logic can't explain everything. Numerical advantages and greater quality do not always win wars or battles. So long as humans form connections, so long as they take value in people, objects, concepts, or ideas, so long as they care for all they have, they will be willing to fight and put it all on the line to preserve what they have or to fight for more of it. But oftentimes, logic may seem like a cage to those who are driven by emotions. And for some who have unchecked power that is coupled with unchecked emotions, and those who act likewise, they will use that power to bring havoc upon the world, seeing it as breaking free and flying high, whatever the cost is to those down below. So when high emotions are coupled with greater logic, there is a great chance to defeat a perceived hyper-emotional evil. And when the smoke clears from that battle, maybe the cycle of emotions and perceived wrongs repeats itself once more. Or, when we remove emotional barriers of understanding, maybe people can come together and learn more about one another, and build a world that thrives on acceptance and understanding. We cannot say with certainty what the future may hold. All we can say is, maybe we should work to understand each other, because acceptance, understanding, and community building are some of the greatest freedoms of all.